Today, let's talk about DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, what it is, where it came from, and why I say it's always been bad policy. And then, in the upcoming weeks, we'll talk about the various litigation that's surrounding DACA. My name is William Kovach, and I am a trained immigration lawyer. I've often been disappointed in the way immigration issues are talked about in the media, although it's not always their fault. Immigration law can be a very complex subject, touching upon constitutional issues as well as personal political points of view. My goal is to explain immigration law to you, concentrating on looking at judicial opinions and executive actions in order to explain how immigration law can have an impact on our community and on our country. I hope that you'll join me as we try to make sense of immigration law and how it may affect the average person. You know, it's hard to believe that DACA is already 9 years old. It was a policy that was born out of frustration. It was something that was meant to be temporary, and it was known from the beginning that there were constitutional and legal problems from the start. Specifically, back in 2012, President Barack Obama grew frustrated over congressional inaction, its failure to pass something that was known as the DREAM Act. The DREAM Act is an acronym for the Development, Relief, and Education for Alien Minors Act. The point of the DREAM Act was to provide relief for young people who were brought to the United States as children, young people who were brought here by their parents and who had no say in whether they were coming to the United States. Most of these young people were raised in the United States since they were young children. They spoke English as fluently as any citizen, and the United States was the only place that they really knew as their home. Nonetheless, because they lacked legal status, there was always a danger that these young people would be picked up and removed, sent back to a country that, well, they really weren't that familiar with. The DREAM Act would have created a pathway to permanent residency and then potentially citizenship for these young people. Indeed, there was no way to create a legal immigration status for these people who had crossed the border without a visa. In order to fix this problem and grant status to these young people who had crossed the border without a visa, it was understood that Congress had to act. Legislative action had to be taken. This was not something that the administration could cure on its own by taking executive action. The executive simply had no power to create legal status for somebody who had come into the country illegally. In fact, even before Barack Obama adopted DACA, he knew that there were severe constitutional restrictions on his ability to address the situation. He knew that he had to rely on Congress to act. To give you an idea of the rhetoric that President Obama was using in 2010, 2011, I want to take a look at some quotes from a town hall that was being broadcast by Univision, so its audience was a Latino audience. This particular town hall occurred in March of 2011. We have Jorge Ramos, who is a news anchor for Univision, and he had already noted that under President Obama's administration, there were more deportations than in any prior administration. The topic then turned to the DREAM Act and the inability of Congress to pass it in 2010, and in particular, how this affected all of these undocumented aliens, these young people who at the time may have been going to school, but at the same time were under this threat that they might be deported, especially in an administration that had picked up its enforcement measures. In this context, Mr. Ramos asked the following question. Mr. President, my question will be as follows. With an executive order, could you be able to stop deportations of the students? President Obama responded, with respect to the notion that I can just suspend deportations through executive order, that's just not the case, because there are laws on the books that Congress has passed. And I know that everybody here at Bell is studying hard, so you know that we've got three branches of government. Congress passes the law. The executive branch's job is to enforce and implement those laws, and then the judiciary has to interpret the laws. There are enough laws on the books by Congress that are very clear in terms of how we have to enforce our immigration system that for me to simply, through executive order, ignore those congressional mandates would not conform with my appropriate role as president. But then politics started playing a role in making it difficult for the DREAM Act to pass. In December of 2010, the DREAM Act had passed the House of Representatives. It came up to a vote in the Senate. At the time, however, it couldn't pass a vote of cloture. That is, it couldn't pass a vote to end debate and vote on the legislation. In colloquial terms, the DREAM Act was filibustered. At the time, there were 55 votes available to pass the DREAM Act. It would have passed the Senate if it were allowed to come to the floor for a vote. And there was significant support from Republicans in the Senate. But then, conservatives branded the DREAM Act amnesty. And for conservatives, that's a dirty word, a word that essentially buries any attempt at immigration reform. Key Republicans then started abandoning their support for the DREAM Act in 2011. This included Arizona Senator John McCain. Many Republicans insisted that in order for the DREAM Act to pass, there had to be stronger border measures taken. But no action was taken on the DREAM Act in 2011, and 2012 was an election year. In an election year, well, nobody wanted to touch such a controversial subject before facing the voters. Nonetheless, President Obama faced pressure from the Latino caucus. Latinos and Hispanics had supported Obama in large numbers, and the DREAM Act was something that they really wanted to see pass. But seeing that politically, Congress was just not going to do anything in an election year, President Obama grew frustrated. And it was out of this frustration that he decided that he was going to do something himself. He used a little-known area of authority known as deferred action in order to try to benefit the would-be dreamers. Dreamers, of course, being the term that we use to refer to those young people who would have benefited from the DREAM Act. So, what is deferred action? Well, deferred action is really nothing more than a promise that the United States government would not seek the removal of somebody who they believed was in the country illegally. Deferred action does not grant legal presence. But once somebody has deferred action, the regulations do allow for that person to be granted work authorization. That is the legal right to work, sometimes referred to as a work permit or an EAD, employment authorization document, if they showed economic necessity. However, deferred action itself is on precarious legal grounds. The words deferred action are not mentioned in the statute, the Immigration and Nationality Act, at all. Rather, deferred action is part of the inherent authority that the president has as the chief law enforcement officer of the nation. It is, in a sense, a form of prosecutorial discretion. Think, for example, when a police officer may pull you over for a traffic infraction. The police officer can give you a ticket and force you to pay a fine. If it's bad enough, the police officer can give you a summons and call you into court to face criminal charges. However, a police officer who pulls you over is not required to give you a ticket. The police officer could let you go with just a warning. That is prosecutorial discretion in action. In a very similar way, the administration is not required to seek the removal of every person who is in the country without legal authorization. However, prior to DACA, deferred action was only used in limited contexts. It was used mostly on a case-by-case basis, mostly for humanitarian purposes. Take, for example, if a family was in the United States without authorization and perhaps a child needed medical attention. Maybe they had a rare medical condition that could only be treated in the United States. It might have been possible then for the parent of that child to apply for deferred action in order to stay in the country, to make sure that the child gets the medical treatment that they need, and at the same time get work authorization because of an economic necessity in order to pay for the medical treatment as well as living expenses while remaining in the United States. Now, that was generally how we expected deferred action to be used. However, in the past, deferred action has been used on something of a larger scale. For example, think about the Liberian Civil War. When the Liberian Civil War broke out, the president at the time used his authority in order to grant temporary protected status. This is a legal status that recognizes that there may be an emergency back in an alien's home country. And because of that emergency, it's dangerous for the alien to return. Therefore, they're giving a temporary legal status and an ability to work in the United States just as long as is needed before they can return to their home country after the emergency passes. The problem is that the Civil War in Liberia lasted over 20 years. And during that 20-year time, the presidents kept renewing TPS. So you had a large number of Liberian nationals who had been living in the United States for a good 20-some years, had been making a life in the United States, and may even have had United States citizen children. But eventually the time came when the Liberian Civil War ended. And when the Liberian Civil War ended, a president came into power who had the confidence of the United States government. It was at that time that President George Bush decided that he was going to end TPS for Liberians. However, at the same time, he understood that it was going to take a while for these Liberians who had been in the country for so long to get their affairs together and be able to return to their home country. So he granted deferred action, deferring his administration from taking action to try to remove all of these Liberians for a year after TPS had been lifted. And in the meantime, those Liberians could apply for work authorization. But again, this was on a very limited scale, and it was just for a very limited period of time. When the Obama administration implemented DACA, it was using deferred action in an unprecedented fashion. The president announced that he was going to use his deferred action authority at a press conference in the Rose Garden.
Effective immediately, the Department of Homeland Security is taking steps to lift the shadow of deportation from these young people. Over the next few months, eligible individuals who do not present a risk to national security or public safety will be able to request temporary relief from deportation proceedings and apply for work authorization. Now, let's be clear, this is not amnesty, this is not immunity. This is not a path to citizenship. It's not a permanent fix. This is a temporary stopgap measure that lets us focus our resources wisely while giving a degree of relief and hope to talented, driven, patriotic young people.
And then, on the same day, the Secretary for Homeland Security published a memo announcing that the DACA program was going to be in effect. It then took about 2 months. And after those 2 months, that's when USCIS published a very detailed list of qualifications and rules on the USCIS website. These were rules that addressed how long a person had to be in the country, at what age they were permitted to have entered the country in order to qualify for DACA, how they had to show continued physical presence in the United States. It also contained very detailed rules concerning potential criminal backgrounds of applicants and what would disqualify a person from receiving DACA. Now, if we immigration advocates are being honest, deferred action was not a true exercise of mere discretion. Instead, DACA was meant to be a whole new program. It looked and it smelled like legislation. It was essentially President Obama trying to use his executive power to gain what he couldn't through Congress. And the hook that came with DACA was the ability to apply for a work permit. Because once an alien had a work permit, a lot of doors then began to be opened. They could get a social security number. They could pay taxes. They could then get a driver's license. Many times it opened the door for aliens who otherwise were not qualified to apply for scholarships. And it opened the door to allow them to buy property. In some ways, DACA was able to allow many young people to come out of the shadows, to stop living in this underground shadow economy and start living a life that many of us Americans simply take for granted. But the problem is that DACA is and always has been bad policy. Yes, DACA solved some immediate problems for all those young people who were brought here as children and who just were stuck working in an underground economy and unable to come out under the shadows. But the problem is, the ends don't justify the means. And in this case, the ends not only were unconstitutional and unlawful, but they locked DACA recipients into this treadmill, a treadmill where they would never be able to get legal status, where they would never be able to shake off this fear that someday a president would come along who would want to institute removal proceedings against them. Because, as I've said, DACA never granted true legal status. DACA was merely a promise, and it has always only been merely a promise. The fact is, if we immigration advocates are being honest, we knew that DACA was unconstitutional, we knew that DACA was unlawful, and we knew that through DACA, the government was really only giving DACA recipients half a loaf. Yes, they had work authorization, but there was no pathway to legalization. There was no legal status. There was no potential for these young people to ever become citizens and be able to fully participate in civic life. We knew that this was merely a promise and not law. Moreover, we knew, and we had to advise our clients, that DACA was never going to be secure. DACA could always be rescinded by subsequent administrations. Indeed, it could have been rescinded by the Obama administration if they chose to do so. Many of us also had this fear that here were people who were undocumented. They were in the country illegally, and they were giving over, as part of the application process, information about their address, their whereabouts, the fact that they had been working illegally. They were giving it to the government. Now, they were giving it to USCIS, which is not the enforcement arm of the immigration apparatus. Nonetheless, even though there's something of a wall between USCIS and ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, there's still a possibility that the information could be passed on between USCIS and ICE and cause a person who had applied for DACA to be placed in removal proceedings. Information that was needed to apply could eventually and potentially be used against that person in further legal proceedings. These were all shortcomings that we immigration lawyers had to warn our clients about. And DACA really didn't take off at first. It was slow to begin with. But after a while, more people were applying for DACA, more people would get their work authorization, more people would find that they could get driver's license and social security numbers and start working. And because it solved so many problems, it became popular among dreamers. Dreamers could come out of the shadows. More importantly, native-born Americans and American citizens could see that dreamers were good and capable people. They were their neighbors. And if DACA allowed these people to stay in the country, well, a lot of people supported that. But DACA lulled us all into a sense of complacency, because this was not a legal status, because it was merely a promise. There would always be limitations on the ability of DACA recipients to live a full American life. They could not vote. They could not serve on a jury. They could never be a citizen. Yet, at the same time, Congress had no incentive to act. Yes, the program was popular among Congresspeople. They could simply support the program and say, look, we want DACA to continue. But as long as all these immediate problems were being solved, there was no pressure placed on Congress to take up the politically difficult issue of finding a real legal solution for DACA recipients. So Congress could just kick the can down the road, and that's exactly what they did. Publicly, they appeared to score points with Latino voters by saying they supported DACA, but then they would never bring the DREAM Act back up or try to pass it. So now, as of mid-July, we have a court, a U.S. District Court, that has found DACA unlawful. And the thing is, this was inevitable. DACA, from the beginning, was unlawful. It's not likely that this decision is going to be overturned on appeal, and I'm going to explain all that in upcoming videos. The problem is that we still have no political stomach to fix the situation. And because we created a policy where we have a class of people who would be in this perpetual state of limbo, this perpetual state of never being able to fully legalize their status, and because it encouraged such people to live out their lives as normal as was possible. Meanwhile, the threat of deportation was always looming over their head. That is why DACA is bad policy. DACA was only meant to be temporary, a temporary fix. It has become permanent. It has become something that has hung around for almost a decade now, and it has prevented Congress from actually acting and doing what it needs to do to legally fix the situation. And having come to the end of our discussion of why DACA is bad policy, in our next video, we will discuss the decision in Texas versus United States and why it's going to be difficult to overturn that decision on appeal. So if you like this video, give us a thumbs up, tell your friends about us, please subscribe, and as always, thank you so much for watching. Thank you for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe. If there are any topics you would like me to address in the future, please let me know in the comments below. Now, I don't like talking about this, but I am currently disabled because of complications following cancer surgery. If you're feeling generous, I'll have a link to my PayPal account in the description below. Thank you.